Most wilderness trails are quiet. Thousands of hikers walk them every year without ever experiencing anything unusual. But sometimes, a routine backpacking trip turns into something that stays with the person forever. This story isn't about monsters or ghosts. It's about a man who spent weeks walking the same trails as everyone else, quietly recording who came, who left, and who was completely alone. Most miles on a backcountry trail pass without incident, and that's exactly why the unusual moments stay with people for years afterward. The accounts in this collection unfold slowly, shaped by ordinary decisions, familiar routines, and encounters that still resist simple explanations. I was 34 when I hiked into the Gila Wilderness in southwestern New Mexico during the last week of September, partly because I needed a break from teaching high school history, and partly because I had always wanted to spend several days in one of the country's oldest designated wilderness areas, where the trails still felt more like routes than destinations. My plan covered 4 days and 3 nights, beginning at a remote Forest Service trailhead before climbing toward a backcountry ranger cabin used during seasonal patrols. Afternoon thunderstorms had mostly ended for the year, daytime temperatures stayed comfortable, and visitor numbers had dropped enough that I expected long stretches without seeing anyone. Before leaving the trailhead, I stopped at the small Forest Service contact station to collect updated trail information. A seasonal ranger named Elaine checked my permit, circled 2 creek crossings on my map where recent flooding had changed the easiest route, and reminded me that radio coverage disappeared almost immediately after the first canyon. While we talked, she answered a landline call from another district, wrote something on a yellow legal pad, then crossed it out before hanging up. Happens more than you'd think. It seemed like a forgettable moment. I signed the register, adjusted my pack, and started hiking. The trail followed a shallow creek beneath cottonwoods before climbing through ponderosa pine, where the smell of warm resin lingered in the afternoon air. Around 3 o'clock, I reached an old trail junction marked by weathered wooden signs and noticed fresh boot prints leading toward a route officially closed for erosion repair. The closure notice looked untouched, its cable still locked across the entrance, yet someone had stepped around both ends instead of removing them. That wasn't especially alarming. People ignored closures all the time. What stood out was that the tracks returned only halfway before leaving the trail completely and disappearing into rocky ground. I kept walking. An hour later, I reached my campsite near a spring where 2 other backpackers had already pitched their tents. They were a retired couple from Arizona, friendly enough to share trail conditions and compare maps over dinner. During the conversation, the husband casually mentioned passing a man wearing a tan work shirt who claimed to be checking boundary markers for the Forest Service. He said the man never introduced himself, carried no visible radio, and seemed oddly interested in whether anyone planned to stay at the ranger cabin farther north. We assumed he worked for a contractor. There wasn't much else to discuss, and darkness settled quickly beneath the trees. Overnight, a steady breeze moved through the canyon, shaking loose pine needles that tapped softly against my rainfly. Just before dawn, I heard what sounded like metal striking metal somewhere in the distance. 3 slow taps, then silence. It happened once more several minutes later. By the time I crawled out of the tent with a cup of coffee, the forest had returned to its usual morning rhythm. Jays argued overhead, squirrels moved through fallen branches, and sunlight filtered between the trunks. I reached the ranger cabin shortly before noon. It sat beside a narrow meadow surrounded by thick timber, with a tool shed, a rain gauge, and an information board listing current trail conditions. The cabin itself wasn't staffed that week, but hikers could use the covered porch during bad weather. I stopped there to refill water, sign the voluntary logbook, and eat lunch. Only 3 entries had been made in the previous 6 days. Mine became the 4th. While I was packing up, I noticed another notebook lying beneath the bench, different from the official register. It wasn't hidden exactly, just tucked far enough underneath that it blended into the shadows. Assuming it belonged to a ranger, I picked it up. The cover was blank. Inside were hand-drawn sketches of trail intersections with short notes beside each one. 2 hikers, horse group, White pickup parked overnight. Solo female with blue tint. None of the pages contained dates. None identified who had written them. The observations weren't dramatic, but they were unusually specific. Before I could examine another page, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. A man about 50 years old stood near the information board wearing hiking clothes that looked newer than the dusty boots beneath them. He nodded politely and asked whether I had seen anyone coming from the south trailhead. I told him only the couple from Arizona. He seemed disappointed rather than relieved. Then he asked whether the cabin had a working radio. That struck me as odd, because anyone familiar with the area knew the seasonal cabin had no permanent communications equipment after budget reductions several years earlier. I told him the nearest ranger station was many miles away. He thanked me, glanced briefly toward the notebook still in my hand, and said he had probably taken the wrong route before walking north, without another word. I watched until the trees swallowed him because something about the exchange felt unfinished. After a minute, I slid the notebook into my pack, planning to leave it at the contact station when I finished the trip. That afternoon, the weather changed unexpectedly. Thick clouds built over the ridges, and cooler air pushed through the forest. Light rain arrived just as I reached another creek crossing. The trail became slick with wet pine needles, slowing my progress enough that I decided to stop earlier than planned at a designated campsite near an old fire scar. Nobody else was there. While gathering water, I found fresh bicycle tire tracks crossing the muddy trail, even though bicycles weren't allowed anywhere inside the wilderness boundary. They approached from the direction of an abandoned administrative road outside the protected area, crossed the trail, and disappeared toward another drainage. Rain erased much of the detail before I finished photographing them. That night I slept lightly because the wind kept changing direction, carrying unfamiliar sounds across the open hillside. Once I heard what resembled an engine idling very far away, though no public roads existed within several miles. By morning the storm had passed, leaving everything washed clean except those bicycle tracks, which had vanished entirely beneath fresh runoff. My final hiking day began with clear skies and cool temperatures. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I came across Elaine, the ranger I'd met on my first morning. She wasn't patrolling alone. A law enforcement officer accompanied her, and both looked more focused than relaxed. She asked whether I had encountered a middle-aged man asking unusual questions about ranger facilities or hikers. I described the conversation at the cabin and handed her the notebook. She flipped through it slowly without saying much. The officer photographed several pages before sealing it inside an evidence bag. Elaine finally explained that another district had reported someone repeatedly contacting remote ranger stations over the previous month, claiming to be conducting visitor surveys while quietly collecting information about isolated cabins, seasonal staffing schedules, and how many hikers typically pass certain trail junctions each day. None of those contacts alone had justified a major response because the individual never threatened anyone or committed an obvious crime. The notebook changed that. It showed someone had been recording visitor movements in remarkable detail over a much longer period than anyone realized. Investigators later searched several abandoned campsites outside the wilderness boundary and recovered maps marked with unofficial observation points overlooking popular trails, though no suspect was ever identified publicly. Months afterward, I received a phone call from Elaine, thanking me for turning in the notebook. She mentioned one final detail that had never appeared in any public report. The yellow legal pad she'd been writing on the morning I checked in contained a message from another ranger district describing a man asking questions about backcountry cabins. She crossed out the note because dispatch later told her the report involved a different national forest hundreds of miles away. During the investigation, they discovered the caller had simply given the wrong forest name over the phone. He had been asking about the Gila all along, and by the time anyone connected the mistake, he had already spent weeks walking the same trails as everyone else while quietly writing down who passed through and when. I was 27 when I volunteered to help with a weekend trail maintenance project in the Olympic National Forest. Mostly because I had recently moved to Washington and wanted to meet people who preferred spending Saturdays clearing brush instead of sitting indoors. I worked as a paramedic during the week, so long hikes and rough weather never bothered me much. And the volunteer coordinator assigned me to a small crew restoring drainage ditches along an old route that connected with a seasonal Forest Service patrol cabin, about 9 miles from the nearest road. Heavy winter storms the previous year had damaged several bridges, leaving portions of the trail lightly traveled even during summer. By early October, the volunteer crews had become smaller, and our group consisted of only 5 people plus the district ranger leading the project. His name was Aaron, and before we left the trailhead, he reminded everyone of something that sounded unusually specific. If anyone encountered a person claiming to redirect volunteers to another work site, we were to confirm it directly with him first. No explanation followed. We assumed it had something to do with liability. The first day passed exactly as expected. We cut back salmonberry, cleaned culverts clogged with needles, and replaced faded trail markers where snow had knocked them sideways. By late afternoon, we reached the patrol cabin, unloaded tools into the storage shed, and settled into assigned campsites nearby. The cabin itself remained locked because it stored maintenance equipment and emergency supplies, but the covered porch served as our staging area. Aaron completed the daily work log, while the rest of us cooked dinner. I noticed he counted every Pulaski, shovel, and crosscut saw before locking the shed, then checked the padlock twice. He explained that tools occasionally disappeared during the off-season, though he sounded more irritated than worried. Overnight, steady rain moved through the valley. By sunrise, the forest smelled of cedar and wet moss, and fog drifted low enough that the treetops vanished into white. We split into 2 teams. My group hiked north to repair drainage, while Aaron and 2 others worked farther south replacing damaged signs. Around midday, my partner and I found fresh orange flagging tape tied to branches beside the trail. That immediately seemed strange because our crew used bright pink tape, not orange, and no other maintenance projects appeared on the district schedule posted at the trailhead. The tape continued for nearly half a mile before leading away from the official trail toward an overgrown logging spur abandoned decades earlier. We stopped there, assuming another crew had simply marked the wrong route. While discussing whether to remove it, a man stepped out from the trees wearing a hard hat, reflective vest, and work gloves. He carried a clipboard and greeted us with complete confidence. "You 2 are supposed to be at the washout," he said. "Aaron sent me to redirect you." If he had sounded uncertain, I probably would have questioned him immediately. Instead, his matter-of-fact tone almost worked. I asked which washout he meant. He pointed farther down the old logging spur and said a bridge inspection crew needed extra hands moving lumber before rain returned. Then he added something that finally caught my attention. He referred to Aaron as Supervisor Mitchell. Aaron wasn't our supervisor, and Mitchell wasn't his last name. Volunteers knew him simply as Aaron because he introduced himself that way dozens of times throughout the season. It was a small mistake, but it didn't fit someone supposedly working with him. I told the man we'd check with Aaron on the radio first. His expression barely changed. "Coverage is bad here," he replied. "You'll lose another hour going back." I thanked him anyway and unclipped a handrailed radio issued to each volunteer. We actually did have poor reception, but after climbing 20 yards onto a rocky slough, I reached Aaron on the second attempt. His response came immediately. "Stay where you are. We're coming to you." I relayed nothing else over the radio because his tone had changed completely. When I looked back toward the logging spur, the man was already walking away without any sign of frustration or urgency. He simply disappeared into the fog between enormous cedars. Aaron reached us about 40 minutes later with the other crew. We searched the logging spur together. It ended at a wide clearing containing the remains of an old equipment landing, abandoned since the 1980s. Fresh tire tracks crossed the muddy ground, despite vehicle access being blocked years earlier by large concrete barriers farther downhill. Hidden beneath the tarp, beside rusting cable reels, sat stacks of unopened chainsaw chains, fuel cans, and boxed power tools. None belonged to the Forest Service. Law enforcement officers arrived that evening after hiking in from another access point. Their search expanded over the next 2 days, and uncovered several temporary supply caches scattered along forgotten logging roads outside the recreation area. Investigators believed the people using those sites had learned volunteer crews often worked predictable schedules deep in the forest with limited communication. Rather than confront anyone directly, they occasionally redirected hikers or volunteers away from active routes whenever they planned to move stolen equipment between caches. The orange flagging tape wasn't random. It quietly guided people away from places they didn't want discovered. What made the case especially confusing was how ordinary the encounters sounded when described individually. A man in work clothes giving directions, fresh survey tape in the woods, a reference to another project. None of it seemed alarming until the details were placed together. Over the following months, detectives linked several recovered tools to commercial burglaries across 3 counties, but they never established exactly how many people had been involved. One suspect was arrested driving a stolen utility trailer filled with construction equipment, yet investigators believed he represented only part of the operation. Nearly a year later, I returned to hike the same trail on my own. The orange tape was long gone. The patrol cabin had a new steel equipment shed and larger signs reminding visitors that official Forest Service employees would always carry agency identification. Before leaving, I stopped to read the volunteer logbook stored inside a weatherproof box on the porch. Most entries thanked previous crews for their work. Near the end of the season, however, one short note written by a ranger stood out. It reminded future crews to remove all unofficial flagging immediately, regardless of how professional it appeared. There was no explanation beneath it. Anyone reading the book for the first time would probably assume it referred to trail maintenance standards. I knew it existed because one man had understood that hikers are far more likely to trust a strip of bright tape leading confidently into the woods than they are to question who tied it there in the first place. I was 46 when this happened, old enough that I had stopped chasing difficult hikes just to prove I could still do them, but young enough to volunteer as a wilderness first responder for search and rescue whenever the county needed extra people. Most callouts ended exactly the way you hope they will. Someone sprained an ankle, missed a trail junction, underestimated the weather, or ran out of water. We found them, walked them out, filled out paperwork, and went home tired. The operation that still bothers me started as one of those routine assignments in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness on the Montana side of the range during the second week of October. Snow had dusted the higher ridges the night before. Daylight was shrinking fast, and the Forest Service had already closed several secondary access roads for the season. I received the page shortly after 6 in the morning. A solo backpacker had failed to return from a 3-day trip after signing in at a remote trail register maintained by a seasonal ranger station. The reporting party was his younger sister, who had his route plan, vehicle description, and expected return time. By 7:30, our command post occupied the gravel parking area outside the small ranger station, where maps covered folding tables beneath an open maintenance shelter, while coffee steamed from dented thermoses in the cold air. The district ranger briefed us using a topographic map, marked with colored grease pencil. The missing hiker intended to follow a loop across 3 drainages, 4 returning to the same trailhead. There was no indication he had planned anything unusual. Weather had been stable until the previous afternoon when a fast-moving front dropped temperatures and covered higher elevations with several inches of snow. Helicopters were unavailable because low clouds sat directly on the ridgelines, so ground teams would carry the search. I joined Team 3 with a deputy, another volunteer named Chris, and Ranger Melissa, who had spent nearly 15 seasons working that district. She knew nearly every creek crossing by memory and had the habit of pausing occasionally to look uphill instead of at the trail, something experienced backcountry people often do because loose rock, damaged trees, and changing weather usually announce themselves from above first. Our assignment covered the eastern section of the planned loop, including a backcountry patrol cabin closed for the season. The first few miles were ordinary. We called the missing man's name at intervals, checked campsites, examined muddy creek banks for fresh prints, and marked searched areas on waterproof maps. Around mid-morning, Melissa stopped beside a narrow stretch of trail where fresh snow preserved several clear boot impressions. They matched the approximate size listed on the missing hiker's registration form, but another set overlapped them. Those second prints belonged to heavier boots with a broad industrial tread pattern, uncommon among recreational hikers. More importantly, they traveled in the opposite direction for a while, before leaving the trail together toward an old horse camp no longer maintained by the Forest Service. We followed them carefully, expecting perhaps another hunter or camper. Instead, we found an extinguished fire wing beside a weathered canvas tarp stretched between lodgepole pines. No one remained there. Empty food cans sat neatly stacked. Fresh sawdust surrounded a recently cut log, and tire marks from a small utility trailer scarred the soft ground, even though no legal vehicle route existed anywhere near the camp. Melissa photographed everything before radioing coordinates to command. Because reception and net drainage faded in and out, half the transmission dissolved into static. Dispatch acknowledged enough to understand we had located an unauthorized campsite. We continued searching for the missing hiker because daylight mattered more than investigating abandoned camps. About an hour later, we reached the closed patrol cabin. Snow clung to the shaded side of the roof while sunlight melted patches along the porch steps. The cabin's metal shutter remained locked exactly as expected, but the woodshed door stood slightly open. Melissa frowned before walking over. Rangers notice those little things because cabins are closed the same way every season. Inside the shed, someone had rearranged stacked firewood to conceal several plastic storage bins. They contained batteries, satellite phone chargers, boxed trail cameras, camouflage netting, and unopened batteries. None carried Forest Service inventory labels. We documented everything without disturbing it further. By then, command instructed all teams to avoid approaching suspicious camps alone until law enforcement could reach them. Unfortunately, reaching us wasn't simple. The nearest deputies still had hours of hiking ahead because washed-out roads forced everyone onto longer approaches. Time pressure shifted. The missing hiker remained our priority, but now we also knew unknown people had been operating from restricted areas near his intended route. Mid-afternoon brought another surprise. Chris found the missing backpacker's trekking pole, leaning neatly against a trail marker, almost 2 miles away from where his tracks had last been identified. Nothing else surrounded it. No pack, no torn clothing, no obvious accident. Just one trekking pole, balanced upright, where anyone walking past would notice it. Melissa studied the ground for several minutes before quietly saying she didn't think it had fallen there naturally. The snow beneath it lacked the disturbance you'd expect if someone had dropped it while walking. It looked placed. We expanded our search into nearby timber. 100 yards downhill, we discovered the missing man's campsite. His tent still stood, lightly dusted with snow. His sleeping bag remained inside. His stove sat beside a pot containing half-cooked rice hardened by the cold. Yet his backpack was gone. So were his boots. We searched until darkness forced us back toward the patrol cabin, using headlamps only when necessary, because the forest reflected enough moonlight from fresh snow to make navigation possible. During that hike out, I noticed something I dismissed at first because fatigue affects judgment after 12 hours in rough country. Every few hundred yards, we crossed our own footprints from earlier that day, except once. At one bend in the trail, an additional set of fresh impressions crossed directly over ours, heading toward the abandoned horse camp after we had already passed through. Someone had walked the trail behind us while we searched uphill. We radioed the observation immediately. Law enforcement teams entered the area before dawn the following morning. Their search uncovered 3 separate hidden camps linked by old logging tracks outside the wilderness boundary. They also found evidence that people had been illegally collecting valuable elk antlers, stealing remote trail cameras, and using abandoned pack routes to move equipment without attracting attention. Late that afternoon, another search team located the missing backpacker alive in a steep ravine nearly 4 miles from his planned route. He had suffered a concussion after falling on loose rock during the snowstorm and wandered downhill in the wrong direction before becoming too disoriented to climb back out. He survived because he eventually found flowing water and sheltered beneath fallen timber until searchers heard his whistle. On paper, the case ended successfully. The official report treated the illegal camps as a separate investigation because no evidence proved the missing hiker had encountered the people using them. That explanation satisfied most everyone involved. It almost satisfied me too, until several weeks later, when investigators returned personal belongings recovered during the search. Among them was the missing man's camera. Most photographs showed exactly what you'd expect: mountain lakes, frost-covered grass, mule deer at sunrise, his tent beside a creek. Near the end of the memory card, however, appeared 4 images he did not remember taking. They were captured late on the afternoon before he disappeared. The first showed an empty section of trail. The second pointed toward the trees beside it. The third was badly blurred, as if the camera had moved suddenly. The fourth focused sharply on a weathered wooden trail register standing at a junction miles from his campsite. Nothing about the register itself was unusual. What caught everyone's attention was the fresh sheet of paper clipped beneath the protective cover. Someone had taped a handwritten notice over the official trail advisory. It directed hikers to follow a temporary detour because of bridge repairs ahead. Investigators checked maintenance records afterward. No bridge repairs had been scheduled anywhere in that district. No ranger had posted the notice, and by the time officers returned to retrieve it, the paper had already been removed, leaving only 2 strips of clean tape on the weathered board where it had briefly been.